Good evening and welcome to this Oriel panel discussion entitled Understanding Corruption. This talk neatly prefaces the publication of a new book by the same name by two of our panelists, giving case studies from across the globe encompassing bribery, political corruption, kleptocracy, and corrupt capital. I'm Marco Zhang, I'm the new development director at Oriel. I'm absolutely delighted to join college, and I'm really delighted that you can join us this evening. I hope we can welcome you back to college properly soon. And before we begin, if you have any questions during the event, please use the chat box. You're going to be muted while our panelists are discussing their initial thoughts, but there will be time at the end for questions and you'll be able to unmute at that point. The event is being recorded and will be shared on our YouTube channel soon. We're joined tonight by a panel of four eminently distinguished Orielenses: Robert Barrington, Professor of Anti-Corruption Practice, and Liz David-Barrett, Professor of Governance and Integrity, both at the University of Sussex. Dominic Martin, who for 30 years has held senior roles in the UK diplomatic service and is a trustee of Transparency International. And Mark Philp, Professor of History and Politics at the University of Warwick and Emeritus Fellow of Oriel. Liz will be facilitating the panel discussion. So before heading into your questions, please do use the chat box. Remember to use the chat box, or you may raise your hand and be called on to ask your question in person. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Liz.
Thanks very much, Marco, and thanks everybody for coming along this evening. I'm going to just start by asking each of the panelists to tell us a little bit about themselves and how they became interested in corruption, very briefly. So we'll go in, I think we'll start with Mark Philp, going in reverse order from Marco's introductions. Mark.
So I was giving a series of lectures that involved Machiavelli in about 1986, and he talks a lot about corruption. And I started getting interested in, how he thought about corruption and how it related to a more kind of a classical tradition, and then how modern conceptions of corruption tended to kind of differ from that. So that's what got me in it in the first place. And as with many of these things, one thing leads to another. And I ended up doing some work with the Council of Europe and with various other kinds of bodies in relation to corruption. And then I had a few very good graduate students who worked on this stuff, including Liz. And the trouble with being an academic is once you've written about a thing once, people keep making you write more about it, which is what I've done. That's probably a good enough introduction.
Okay, extremely modest as ever. Okay, Dominic, how did you get interested in this?
Yeah, so after I left Oriel in 1987, I spent, as Marco said, some time in the Foreign Office, and one of the jobs I did was I ended up as ambassador to an organization called the OECD, which is looks after various aspects of international economic policy. And one of the things that the OECD does is think about the rules around bribery and how we can try and create some sort of international understanding about how countries should approach the issue. And I arrived just after the big Al Yamama arms deal scandal involving BAE Systems, which was a huge multi-billion arms deal between one of the UK's largest companies and Saudi Arabia. And the story broke that there were various aspects of that transaction which did not stand up to scrutiny, and the rest of the world started asking rather difficult questions of the UK at the OECD, and I had to answer them. And the thing that struck me sitting in that rather comfortable position that I had in Paris was that, first of all, this was really damaging the UK's international reputation. And secondly, most people in senior positions in the UK were apparently completely oblivious to that damage. And it was an extraordinary, like it was a sort of guilty secret. No one really wanted to talk about it. No one really wanted to recognized there was a problem. And my view was that if the UK didn't do something about it pretty damn quick, we would increasingly get ourselves into trouble. Unfortunately, I was not the only person thinking that. There were some enlightened people in the government and enlightened people outside the government, including Transparency International, which is the organization I'm now a trustee of. Over the course of the next few years, things did change, and a new Bribery Act was brought in the UK, which I think has tightened up our position and improved our reputation, though there are still some serious weaknesses, and perhaps we'll discuss them later on today. But that's what it's all about.
Great, thanks very much, Dominic. So turning to Robert, and Robert, I wonder if when you're telling us how you became interested in corruption, you might also just touch on your role in the Bribery Act that Dominic just mentioned. So continuing the story, as it were.
Thank you, Liz. Good evening, everybody. After I left Oriel and did a PhD, I didn't want to work in academia, and I worked in the not-for-profit sector, particularly in environmental organisations, and then went into the city, working in asset management. In both of those roles, I came up against corruption as a block to progress, and as an issue in other areas as well. So just as Dominic was as a Foreign Office Mandarin dealing with the fallout of the BAE Systems scandal on the international stage, I was representing one of the largest shareholders in BAE Systems, and we were asking the management behind the scenes, well, what's all this about? You know, why are you doing business in this way? I always seem to be coming up against corruption as a block to progress in different ways, particularly in international development. And when I wanted to move out of the city, I moved into Transparency International, which Dominic has already mentioned, which at the time was really the only large international NGO that was working on corruption. And almost immediately I got pitched into the campaign that TI was always running to try and secure a new Bribery Act off the back of that BAE Systems scandal. And so I was charged with trying to run that campaign in the UK. And eventually it was successful. It not just through the efforts of TI, but particularly, actually, I think Dominic's efforts at the OECD and getting the OECD to put pressure on the British government. It became actually quite a large international campaign, because it was realised that if Britain moved on this, then that would really generate other international pressure. And since then, there have been laws in many other countries, including France, all aligned to the OECD Convention. So that's what brought me in, and then I was in TI for 10 years before joining Liz at the Centre for the Study of Corruption in Sussex.
Fantastic, thanks. So I guess it must be my turn. I left Oriel in 1995, and that was the year in which the first set of Yugoslav, well, not first, but that set of Yugoslav wars ended, and I got very interested in Eastern Europe and particularly the Balkans. And so within a few years, I moved to Zagreb in Croatia, and I worked as a journalist for a couple of years. And while I was there, I was really struck by, many of the stories that were coming out were about pretty high-level corruption in the privatization process in Croatia. And I think I was struck partly by the sort of hypocrisy of that there were a number of leaders who'd come into office very much with a sort of make Croatia great again kind of a campaign. And then once they'd got into office, they were quite busily selling off state assets to their cronies for very little money. And so very much a sort of Russian type story in terms of what was happening with privatization there. And so that was hypocritical. It seemed to me, it got me interested in, what happens when you get into public office. Are people motivated to go into it out of public interest serving reasons? And if so, how can we explain that this happens? So I think at some point I thought I'd like to get more deeply into understanding that. And I think I called up Mark Philp and said, I'm thinking about doing a DPhil. And he probably had a big sigh at the prospect. But eventually, a couple of years later, I came back and did a DPhil with Mark on political corruption in the transition process, looking at Croatia and Hungary in particular. And then that sort of took me on this journey of studying corruption in different contexts. So moved on from Eastern Europe to partly to looking at the UK and did some research for Transparency International UK when Robert was there. So also looking at the impact of the Bribery Act, but looking at lobbying, the revolving door, corruption in local government. Then had a postdoc at the Said Business School here in Oxford, where I was looking again specifically more at the kind of business side of bribery, but also at international anti-corruption initiatives like the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. And then I've been at Sussex since 2014, so also moved geographically in terms of corruption, looked more at Africa, Caribbean, but with particular interest in public procurement, which if you're not a transition country and you've done a lot of privatization, one of the big areas for corruption is public procurement. So that's been a big research focus for me in the last few years. And then, of course, in the last couple of years, we've been quite busy also commenting on corruption in the UK with a number of scandals arising here too. So moving on then, we're all here to talk about corruption. We all work on corruption. I wondered if I could ask people to tell us why they think corruption is important. Why should we care about this? And I'm going to go in the same order. So Mark, coming to you.
I'm probably the worst person to start with, because although I've written a lot about corruption and the definition of corruption, I have real reservations about whether we should be talking about that thing, because I don't think it's a single thing. I think it's a multiple, complex set of things, that there's a danger in putting them all in the same bucket and thinking about them as if somehow necessarily kind of connected with each other. Nonetheless, I think what is important is that institutions that rule other people should be capable of legitimating their actions to those people. And in order to do that, they need to be, those who are ruled need to be sure that those who are ruling them are following sets of procedures and practices that they themselves endorse. So the complexity sort of in many cases arises from the fact that there are different views in the public and in the public sphere about what the appropriate set of rules are. There's a politics about how you fix those rules and how you interpret them and determine their outcomes. There's often a kind of cost to some individuals from following one set of rules rather than to, and again to other individuals in those rules being in place. The idea that there is a single neutral way of thinking about political corruption that can be applied willy-nilly across the piece, I think just doesn't work. I think the challenge is to be really precise and really careful about what's at stake in any particular situation, who gains, who loses, who's involved, how extensive it is. And I think, the basic moral normative issue is right, that you should worry about whether or not those who are exercising power over you are doing so in a way that can command a much wider legitimacy. But I also think there's a politics to anti-corruption just as there is to kind of corruption, and we need to watch that. And it's not the worst thing. It's often involved with worse things. War, sort of violence within states. I mean, Syria, I'm sure, has problems with corruption, but it's got a lot worse problems. So the issue is always going to be, why we should tackle it now and here in relation to these things, as opposed to worrying about other kinds of things. And I think there's a tendency in some of the kind of anti-corruption movement to treat it as the main sort of thing that we should be concerned about. I'll stop there.
Okay, great. So then I'm going to go to Robert next. Robert, as someone who was heading an organisation that was very much in this advocacy role, very much a campaigner on anti-corruption, what would you say to that? And why do you think that corruption is something we should care about?
Thank you, Liz. I mean, my goodness, I would love to have a 3-hour debate with Mark about this. There's so much to say. But first off, I agree with his basic contention that the word corruption itself is, it's such a catch-all that it is most helpfully broken down into subcategories. And there are very obvious ones like bribery and cronyism, for example. And as soon as you start talking about the subcategories, it becomes a bit more sort of familiar to people about what you're really talking about. And in fact, if you use the word corruption just by itself, then it can not only be confusing, it can so easily be sort of just used as a basic political insult. And you see a lot of that in the States at the moment. Democrats and Republicans each blaming each other for being corrupt without, intending to define it, just knowing it's a bad thing. So why is it a bad thing? Well, where I possibly disagree with Mark slightly is that I think you can see a commonality amongst lots of different forms of corruption, and indeed amongst most political corruption. There are some standard definitions of corruption, and the one I usually turn to is the TI one, of the abuse of entrusted power for private gain, which has those 3 basic concepts. Somebody has entrusted power, somebody's abusing it, and they're making a gain from it. Or to put in very simple terms, it's basically people accumulating power and money at the expense of other people by evading or bending the rules. So, there are lots of ways you can express this. But ultimately, Mark has posed this question, why does it matter, or why does it matter more than other things? And I think it matters because whenever you look deeply into corruption, you can always find some kind of harm and some kind of victim, and they're usually fairly extensive, deep harm and badly harmed victims. So, one of the problems that we will all know from studying corruption is to identify the harm and victims is extremely hard. It can be very obvious in certain cases, like healthcare corruption, for example. But in a case of political corruption, for example, at the moment, if we were to posit the idea that the current British government had acted corruptly, who is really harmed by that? Who are the victims? It is hard to pin that down. John Major had an attempt today and would have convinced some people, but not others. So, I think it matters because there is harm and there are victims, but actually identifying those and pinning them down is pretty difficult. Just the final thing I would say is Mark is sort of, wondering whether there's some kind of hierarchy in which anti-corruption activists think corruption should be at the top of global harms, and maybe it's not always at the top. Of course, it's not always at the top, and there are other, bigger harms. But one thing you notice about corruption is it's always there with the other harms, whether it's environmental damage, whether it's human rights abuses, whether it's autocracy. You will see corruption is playing a role pretty much in all of those things. So without saying it's at the top of the list, I think it's always there, and therefore it always needs to be considered.
Great, thanks. And Dominic, you talked a bit in your previous remarks about how you got interested in corruption, partly because of the damage being done to the UK's reputation. So I wondered if you'd like to talk any more about that and perhaps comment on the sort of current issues, but also tell us your broader thoughts on why we should care about corruption.
Yeah, so maybe I'll start with the second bit, really. I think Robert is right. I mean, corruption basically undermines the trust between the people and the people who govern them, and that the erosion of that trust can be very damaging for countries. And and at extremes, you see you see state breakdown, and you see conflict. And it's certainly plausible, for example, to argue that the roots of what's happening, what we're seeing in the Ukraine at the moment, has its origins in the corrupt behavior of former Ukrainian regimes and the unwillingness of the people of Ukraine to want to tolerate that behavior anymore. Unfortunately, those regimes had sponsors in other countries who've come to their aid. So I think another angle to think about it, though, Liz, is it's to try and strip away the morality for a second. Not that the moral issues aren't important, but just to see it as purely on economic terms why it's a bad thing. So I mean, corruption is at one level a form of taxation. It's a diversion of resources away from the owners of the resource, and the diversion to other actors, and it's about the most inefficient form of taxation you could possibly imagine from an economic point of view. It strikes me, apart from the fact that the lack of consent on the part of the taxed, it's also an extremely inefficient allocation of resources across an economy. It's inefficient because it's not going to the most efficient uses of the resources, but it's also inefficient because it's by definition not going to be broad-based enough compared with normal forms of taxation. And then the revenues are not necessarily being used for the purposes that most people would expect legitimate taxation to go on. So I think you can make a case about why corruption is a really divisive thing in societies from a purely economic perspective as well as a moral one. And a social one. And just going back to my own experiences, I do think that the journey that the UK went on from about 2005 to, let's say, 2015 was a pretty interesting one. There really was an attempt by some people at the centre of the UK system to try and clean up our act, put our own house in order, to try and set some sort of example. And the legislation that was passed in 2010 is world leading in many respects, and certainly overtook the previous sort of the previous front runner in terms of quality of legislation, which was the American Foreign Corrupt Practice Act of 1977. In terms of its coverage and its terms of its quality as a piece of law. I think what we're seeing now, I worry about it, and I'm interested to hear the other panelists' views on this in the debate, is an erosion in the consensus that it is such an important issue. I think that our ability to respond to the challenge is being undermined by a lack of political will and a lack of resourcing. And there's a very interesting paper out today, Robert's involved with, about the amount of resource we actually put into the policing of corruption in the UK. And we, as a society, I think we need to look very carefully at whether we're going backwards at the moment.
Great, thanks very much. So I think for me, I mean, there is quite a lot of research around those harms from corruption. There's certainly research suggesting that corruption is bad for economic growth, it's bad for attracting foreign direct investment, it tends to exacerbate inequality. But I think those kinds of big patterns are often difficult for people to grasp. And in general, actually, those harms from corruption are not always obvious. Similar to people often say about white collar crime, it's difficult for people to envisage who the victim is or what the harm is. But I think in the course of research, I've come across a number of cases where you really see what those harms are. So thinking about the corruption in public procurement, which is really common all around the world, that the public procurement process gets corrupted. And we often tend to think of that just as a waste of public money. I think you've seen that a lot with debates in the UK about COVID procurement, that people often focusing on public money that's being wasted, but that's a case where we've often seen real harms coming out of that are much more tangible. So if you buy PPE that's not fit for purpose, then obviously you're not protecting people in the way that you claim to be, or you're not able to use that, and there's a shortage for someone else. So often I think in that procurement sphere, it's easier to see what the harms are. And you see in construction, where there's corruption in the construction of big buildings, sometimes those buildings collapse, or roads are very poor quality. So it's not just about wasting public money there, but about real tangible harms that people are facing as a result of that. So I think there's sort of one set of harms there. But I think actually what gets me more than anything about it is this this undermining of the rule of law, and that when corruption happens, it's not just that you're wasting public money, but you're diverting people in public office from that duty to serve the public interest. So I sort of imagine that someone is in public office to try and serve the public interest, and what corruption does is it sort of pushes them off course and makes them make policy in ways that are quite likely not to serve the public interest. Now, there could be cases where they're pushed off course, but it still has a good outcome, of course. Even in that case, I'd argue that there's still damage to the rule of law by the fact that the process has been pushed off course by a fairly narrow interest group that is then benefiting rather than the public. So that's what gets me about corruption, I think. Now I'm going to ask everyone to talk a little bit about particular areas of their expertise. So I'm going to come first of all to Robert. Robert, we're here partly because we've got a book coming out soon, and that book covers several areas. So perhaps I'll ask you first to talk a little bit about the book, and then we'll talk about some of the areas that are covered in the book. So we'll have Mark talking about political corruption, Dominic on the business angle, and I'm going to talk about this phenomenon of state capture or grand corruption. So Robert, tell us about the book.
Thank you, Liz. And I should give a shout out to our publisher, who's Alison Houston. I'm not sure if she's on the call, but she's also an Orielensis and runs Agenda Publishing. So this is really an Oriel team effort, this book. It's really a basic introduction to corruption for those who don't know much about it. We divide it into 4 sections, some very obvious ones: bribery, political corruption, kleptocracy and state capture, and corrupt capital, as we call it, which is the proceeds of corruption. Where do they end up around the world? And the way that we do this is we've got experts writing on each of those topics, but then we've got a series of case studies looking at some of the big cases around the world, but also some lesser known ones. So there are some very well-known cases. Dominic referenced the BAE Systems case, which we haven't written about, but we've written about some more modern versions of that, Alstom, Odebrecht. We've also got cases about some of the big kleptocrats, including Sepp Blatter and FIFA, for example. A slightly unusual example because he doesn't run a state, or didn't run a state, but he ran a fiefdom. So there's lots there. And the way we've approached the case studies is to try and write them each up in the same way. So we've used a very formal template, which looks at the case from every possible aspect: the theory of corruption that applies, a basic narrative of what happened, who were the beneficiaries, what was the harm, what were the sanctions or the reactions against it, what happened, and so on and so forth. So it's a book that's trying to give a basic introduction to people who aren't familiar with the subject, illustrated by cases that people will have heard of. And again, just playing into what Mark said a bit, I think, one of the things that I tend to do, once you know more about corruption, you tend to see current events through the lens of corruption. Is corruption happening here? What kind of corruption? Is there a beneficiary? And we're really applying that to some well-known cases of corruption, so people will know they are cases of corruption, but not necessarily presented in a way that people would normally expect. So everybody's familiar with FIFA, but normally through the World Cup. This gives an insight into the inner workings of FIFA. What was going on? Who actually made money out of it, and why was that wrong? That theme is replicated throughout the book. So that's my sales pitch for the book, and I'll finish there, I think.
Great stuff. Okay, so turning to Mark then, give us a few minutes on political corruption, Mark, and of course, any thoughts on how that relates to the UK and recent events?
So what I should really do to start is to commend my colleague Mark Knights's new book called Trust and Distrust, Corruption in Public Office in Britain between 1600 and 1850. I mean, it's a great book, but one clear lesson from the book is that there's a hugely long process of contestation and reform that's far from linear, that the state is not magically reformed at some point, that reform processes are fragile and often reversed, and that the anti-corruption movements that arise to challenge the state or various public officials at various times are often motivated by kind of deeply political concerns. So it gives us a much more kind of complex sense of the kind of background that the British state has arisen from. I mean, I liked what Liz said about what really gets her about corruption, but I think it's a very English sort of conception. I don't think procedure and process and the rule of law weigh nearly as much in lots of other countries. And I could give instances, but Robert asked me to say something about Britain. And that's an interesting question. I think we ought to think quite hard about whether we want to use the term corruption in the current context, for example, in relation to the government. I mean, the Audit Office reports of procurement under lockdown don't exactly inspire confidence in the robustness of the procedures that are meant to be in place against cronyism and kickbacks for political support. Except that the audit report exists, and the audit report is out there and is beginning to have effects and is the basis for a reaction by the system and investigations in the system, which will have longer kind of term consequences. The Owen Paterson debacle, in which the PM and a group of trusted friends decided that the rules could be suspended and then rewritten, that didn't happen. I mean, it was a tense 24 hours, but it didn't happen. I do think we're in a situation in which the ethics system in government is under continuous strain from a form of leadership in which places very little weight on procedural constraints. But I do think one of the things that reading Mark's book persuades you of is that we're in a dramatically different position than we were in the 18th century. There are things in place, even if they're weaker than we'd like. They're not electric fences that stop people from doing things. They're more like elastic constraints where they put pressure on various kinds of practices and various procedures. But they're elastic in that there's pushback against them. So what you have is currently a very complex sort of dynamic sort of situation at the center of government. But you shouldn't underestimate the extent to which part of that dynamic is a set of historical arrangements governing our political order, in which parliamentary sovereignty fundamentally will constrain what judges and watchdogs can do. In Britain, politics rules, and politics is always incompletely constrained by watchdogs, by attempts to kind of control and determine sort of appropriate levels of kind of political practice by standards in public life. So do we want to say we're mired in corruption? I think that just underlies what an emotive and contested term that is. I think we need more care in separating out those different kind of elements. I think we should, if we look at what's happening, what I think we've got is, rather than a systematically criminally minded body, what you have is a bunch of rather incompetent, self-serving, hubristic and sleazy characters who push at the limits and think that they're above them, and then find that the system kind of responds to them. The tipping point for such a system is very difficult to gauge. The point at which we reach no return is difficult to gauge. The tools we have to respond are also not completely under our control. You only have to read the full coverage of the press to realize that it doesn't sit in the same place in every kind of on every kind of issue. So what we have is a very complex, contested sort of case. What I think I would want to say more than anything else is that putting corruption at the center of it is actually likely to damage the political system much more than if we stick to, have you followed the procedures? Have you done what you reported in the way that you should? Are you sort of being held accountable appropriately? Have you acted in the appropriate kind? I mean, that more detailed language is much more useful than a language of corruption. And as Liz knows, in Eastern Europe, the language of corruption very quickly became a kind of political football. It would be terrible, I think, if that happened here.
Press you a tiny bit on that, Mark, because I think, I agree with a lot of what you've said around the robustness actually of UK institutions, but on the point about whether we talk about whether you violated procedures and whether we sort of stick to that language rather than calling it corruption. I mean, in a sense, it seems to me that the Prime Minister at the moment is hiding behind procedure. So there's a tendency to say, oh, well, we'll have an inquiry. We'll wait for the inquiry. Oh, now the police are looking at it. And I think, one of the things you've written about is political accountability. And it struck me that political accountability seems to be somewhat missing at the moment. And there's almost a hiding behind procedure instead.
So I don't disagree that if I were in Parliament and a Conservative MP, I would be doing something different than the majority are currently doing. But that is a political process. It's a slow process. I think it's a process in which reputations are gradually falling apart. I think it's doing immense damage to the public's view of what politicians are like, but I think that's evenly spread. I don't think, for the most part, I mean, what people tend to say is all politicians are like that, rather than just the government is like that. The question as to could it be otherwise is, in the end, the question of how you command that sovereignty in Parliament, and the responsibility lies very firmly, I think, on MPs in Parliament. But the questions they should be sort of asking are, or they should be pressing questions about when's the report coming, how's that going to be reacted to, and so on. I agree there's a danger that it just ends up in a kind of Westminster bubble, but I think things are now sufficiently serious that that's unlikely to be the outcome.
Okay, great. So we're going to now move on to a business perspective. Dominic, what's a take on sort of business and corruption? How does business see corruption? What does the perspective look like from there?
Thanks, Liz. And I'd like to come back to some of the points Mark made as well at some point, and we get a chance, because it's very interesting. I'm
sure,
not,
go ahead. Dive
well,
in.
I'm not quite so confident that our institutions and processes are as strong as Mark implies. I think that.
Sorry, I wasn't implying they're strong. They're elastic, but the point at which the elastic breaks is still to be determined. But
yeah. I think we rely too much on norm and precedent, which if someone has the guts to the chutzpah to ignore the precedents and ignore the norms, turns out that we have no redress. That's my worry about some of the things that's happening. Anyway, business. So I think first of all, I should say that I haven't been involved in writing the book, and I'm really looking forward to reading it and reading the business case studies. And I hope that they won't contradict anything I'm about to say. I think one of the challenges when you're talking about business and corruption is that it's a very broad term, business, and I think sometimes you talking about corruption and business as a single concept, you can reach over generalizations which don't necessarily take you very far. So I'm going to try and divide it into three types of corrupt activity that you might associate with business. So first of all, I'm going to start with the real bad boys. These are businesses whose business model is based on securing competitive advantage through corrupt means. It is an explicit decision of the leadership of the business that they will do what they will make profit and personal gain through the use of corrupt activity. These are often overtly criminal enterprises, but not always. And we have seen in history, for example, the way in which certain companies have secured lucrative contracts by explicitly corrupt means, bribing the sister of the president, for oil trade or oil contracts or whatever it might be. And the extractive industries historically were very weak in this area, and a lot of the focus on improving the behavior of that sector has a lot of effort has been put into improving the behavior of that sector, including through things like the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which Liz mentioned. Still more work to be done, but it's more difficult to get away with it than it used to be. The second category of businesses are the ones which quite often do not break the law themselves, but they are people who knowingly or perhaps unknowingly, but if they looked a bit harder, they would find out pretty quickly, they are facilitating corrupt actors. And these are the enablers of corruption, and these can be lawyers, they can be accountants, they can be estate agents, they can be company registration professionals, they can be bankers, they can be public schools. And these are people who don't ask enough questions about where the money's coming from, don't ask enough questions about where it's going, and are often paid an enormous amount of money in the process. And we have a particular problem, I think, in this country with the enabling of corruption around the world, not just in the UK, but also in the dependent territories, the overseas territories for which we are responsible as a country. And Robert has done a lot of work on this over the years, but it strikes me that it is quite right that so much of the business focus of anti-corruption work is currently on these enablers, because it is clearly an ongoing problem which we haven't worked out a way of addressing as a society. And then the third category is a slightly different category. So there are lots of businesses, lots of large corporates whose leadership are genuinely committed to operating in an ethical way, and believe that they are believe that their companies are doing good in the world in whatever respect doing good means in their corporate strategy. Certainly, they would not condone corruption. Certainly, they would not condone some of the behaviours that I've listed before. However, the trouble with companies is that and leadership of companies is you're responsible for everyone who works for you, and and it is very easy to set up incentive systems within companies which allow individuals to see the potential for personal gain through corrupt behaviour. And a lot of effort, and the UK Bribery Act was obviously a key example of it, has been in helping companies develop the internal processes necessary to prevent people who speak in their name being corrupt, even without the deliberate, contrary to the spirit of what the company is trying to do. I mean, the company would be horrified if they knew what was going on in their name, but it happens. And one of the things that I think it took quite a long time for the penny to drop is that no company anywhere is immune from this sort of behavior. The actor, the person speaking in your name, whether it be your own employee or the agent you're using in some other country which you're not familiar with, and if you don't do enough checks and there aren't enough internal controls, if you don't do the right sorts of training, this will happen to your company. You cannot rely on the simple. You cannot rely on the inherent morality of your employees, and it's taken a long time for the penny to drop. But I do believe the penny has dropped in large numbers of companies. And in fact, if you want to be optimistic, if you want to take an optimistic note about the corruption debate, I do think that after several decades in which governments were the ones that were pushing this agenda the most, I now actually think that the business arguments against corruption are the ones that are probably the most are driving the agenda the most at the moment. It's partly to do with the leadership of companies, but it's also to do with the growing power of the ESG investor community, that's environment, social and governance community, who are increasingly powerful force in the financial world, and have made it quite clear to the directors of companies that they won't get the investment dollars they need if they don't have the right standards in place, whether it be on climate change or whether it be on corruption. So there is some good news there, and some of the things that the anti-corruption campaigners have been championing, for example, transparency over the ownership of companies, beneficial ownership. That used to be pushed largely by governments. I now think that it's actually other companies that see the advantages of this the most. Knowing who you're dealing with is such a huge benefit if you're running a business, particularly in certain parts of the world, including the UK.
Yeah, I think I agree with you there, actually, Dominic, around the shift. Yeah, that businesses are often quite proactive now. Yeah.
Okay, well, I'll wrap up there, Liz. I've probably gone on. I was just going to throw out one dilemma, which I'd be interested in other people's views on. I do think there is a risk. I do think that we're loading a lot of requirements on businesses to improve their practices, which I think is right. But the risk is that you basically load costs on the virtuous, and the ones who have no intention the ones who want to be corrupt are going to ignore the rules anyway. And actually, you've increased the incentive to be corrupt because the gap between your costs and their costs has increased. And you only have to think of, for example, know your customer rules and how annoying they can be. When your bank comes to you yet again and says, can you prove who you are to me so that I know who you are? You know, how many millions of people are doing that around the world? Who, you know, and the guys, you know, loading costs on the individual, loading costs on the institutions, whereas the guys who are actually engaged in the real corrupt activities are probably finding those quite easy to circumvent and just getting on with it. So I think there is a real issue around the design of regulation in this space, which we haven't quite got right.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd agree with you on that. And so my next book is going to be about state capture. So I'm just going to talk about that for a minute or so. So I'm actually going back in a way to where I started. So if you think about those Croatian tycoons capturing the privatization process, what I'm looking at now is how this phenomenon has resurfaced again. So it was originally a term that was coined to describe that particular practice that was very common in former Soviet and Central and East European countries in the early years of transition. And what you got was that these business groups were coming along and influencing the laws and the policies as they were being made, and hence quite a damaging form of corruption where they then benefited from those laws ever afterwards because they'd been able to influence them right at the beginning. So that concept was coined to talk about that phenomenon at the time. In the last couple of years, what we've seen is that re-emerging, but this time driven much more by people from the politics side of things. So we've seen leaders getting into government, often democratically elected, but then once in government, really abusing that power to expand into changing the rules of the game, sometimes changing the constitution, sometimes rushing through a lot of legislation without proper scrutiny, and then moving that out and disabling some of those institutions that are supposed to hold them to account. So undermining the audit institution, the judiciary, the media. And that's something that I saw happening initially in Hungary with Orban coming in as Prime Minister in 2010, but it's something I think we see as a pattern emerging more and more around the world in other countries too. However, I would like to have some time for questions. So I wonder, we've got a few in the chat, but would anyone like to, if you'd like to actually ask a question, please raise your hand now and we'll come to you. In the meantime, I'll just read out a couple of questions from the chat and then perhaps we could have quick responses from everybody. So we've got somebody asking, I wonder if after exposure of corrupt practice previously accepted as normal, there can be justification for compensation for individuals or groups. I'm thinking of the Roman Catholic Church in Ireland, but other examples could be cited in the UK. We have also got someone asking what's the difference between corruption and lobbying, which of course, lobbying, typically legal, can be a useful part of the political system, but when does it become corrupt? And we have someone asking, I'm curious if or how the dynamics around corruption have been changed by the much more polarized information environment of the last 10 years. Could I come back? I'm going to go to everybody. You've got 90 seconds, so choose which question you want to answer. And I'm going to come first of all to you, Mark.
Yeah, just on the last one, which I think is a really interesting question. I think the polarization has been immense and very damaging to the kind of political system. And there is, I mean, some responsibility for that lies with the companies that govern social media. And it's actually been very difficult to get those companies to come to the negotiating table and just try to work out ways in which they can limit the kind of harms that social media kind of cause within the political system. And just a simple kind of example is, there's absolutely no doubt that women politicians, and particularly women from ethnic minorities, are systematically more harassed and intimidated through kind of social media than any other kind of politician. And that's the potential cost to our political system of excluding women from the process is huge. But it is very much a function of social media. That's my 90 seconds worth.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. Dominic?
Well, maybe I should tackle the corruption versus lobbying question. So I think government needs external inputs to produce good public policy. And everyone lobbies. NGOs lobby, academics lobby, citizens lobby, businesses lobby. And it doesn't need to be perceived as corrupt, but the risks are very real. And influencing the public policy agenda when you have a financial stake in the outcome is a very serious, you can just see the traps you can fall into on both sides of the equation. So the solution for me, and it's a very obvious one, is transparency. I mean, if you are lobbying for a cause, you should be prepared to have that lobby, have the fact that you spoke to the minister out there in public, and what you said and what was the response said out there in public as well. And then people can judge whether that was, and if you want to keep it secret, you've got to ask yourself, why you want to keep it secret? There may be some legitimate confidentiality or competitive tension reasons why you want to keep it secret, but you need to have a bloody good reason, I think, to keep what you're saying to government secret from the citizens to whom that government is accountable, in my view. So the default should always be openness, really. Lobby by all means, but don't do it in secret.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Dominic. Robert.
Thank you. Very brief answers. Compensation, yes. There is harm, there are real victims, money is being made. I think there's a very good case for compensation. In cases where money isn't being made, and somebody mentioned the church, some traditional definitions of corruption don't really encompass religious institutions. I think it's really vital that if you use a definition of corruption, you do encompass religious institutions because they are equally prone, if not more so. And I also want to come back on something that Mark said, which is the dangers of putting corruption centre stage in a country like the UK. Does it do more harm than good? I would just say, I think it is the government and certain politicians who are putting corruption centre stage by their behaviours, and we ignore that at our peril. And it's in the way that you shouldn't overstate it, you shouldn't understate it either, because that also carries risks and dangers. And finally, I just draw everybody's attention on the sort of lobbying, political donations, political capture side to the puppeteer case in Australia. Brilliant write-up in today's Financial Times about it. Really fascinating attempt to influence Australian politics by the back door.
Fantastic. And I think I will just quickly tackle the lobbying question. I do think it's a really difficult one, lobbying, and I think it's something that has become more difficult because of the way that the state has changed in the last 20 years, and the fact that so much is outsourced to the private sector. And while I didn't have a problem with that in general, what it means often is that there's a lot of blurring between public and private sectors. There's a lot of relying on private sector companies for advice on how you write your policy, people being seconded into government and then able to write policies from which their companies are later benefiting. So I think the state and the relationship between the state and the private sector has changed a lot, and our rules and norms have not really caught up with that. So that would be my take on that one. However, I'll hand back to Marco and Catherine.
Thank you very much, Liz, and thank you to the entire panel. That was an absolutely fascinating talk. We really appreciate the time that you've given us, and thank you to the audience at home. Thank you for joining us once again tonight. I hope you can come back to Oriel and join an intellectual conversation in hall over port, I've been told, soon. Please do come again and join our online events when you can. Good night.